choose left or right here. That's all right. Oh. So, welcome everybody to Waterstones Winchester High Street. Oh, sorry, yes, we need to do that. Welcome everybody to Waterstones Winchester High Street, and welcome S.J. Watson, or can I call you Steve? Yeah. Steve. Thank you for coming. Thank you for coming all the way out here this evening to join us.
Thank you for inviting me.
That's all right. It's a pleasure. We're going to Steve and I will have a bit of a chat about his books and writing and things like that, but then we'll be open to questions from the audience. That's you. So be prepared. We expect audience participation. We were going to start a bit with Steve just reading a little bit, a few minutes, from his book, just to set the mood, as it were. So this is from his new book, Final Cut.
From the new book, yeah. I'm just going to read the opening. Well, it's kind of a prologue, but I don't like prologues, so I've just called it Then. She runs across the moor as hard and as fast as she can. The sliver of an old moon hangs above her, and somewhere far behind, the village lights shine anemic yellow. But she keeps her eyes fixed forward. She sees nothing but the road ahead, and hears only the wheeze of her dry breath and the cawing of the gulls as they swoop and dive. There are no sounds of pursuit, no shouting, no howling of dogs. She is safe, she thinks. She can calm down, stop running and walk. It's over. But still, she runs. She pushes herself harder, her limbs wheel, momentum carries her until she's on the edge of tumbling like a marionette, wires snipped, head over heels. A car flashes past on the horizon, and then it happens. Her body goes numb, as if she's fallen into cotton wool. Her arms and legs circle in front of her, but they look alien. They're moving independently. She has no control. It's like looking through the wrong end of a telescope. She tries to draw breath, to blink herself back to reality, but it's too late. Her body has rebelled. When she tries to stop running, she finds she can't. Her foot hits something then. It registers only as an abstract pain, dull like the dentist's drill after the needle, but still she trips in slow motion as if she's falling through sludge. Her hands fly forward and she hits the cold ground, squeezing the breath from her lungs like air from a paper bag. She lies still. She could rest, she thinks, forever if need be. She sees herself as if from a distance, as if she's in a documentary. She's lying there in the dark, her eyes open, her lips blue. They'll find her in the morning, frozen. It wouldn't be so bad. But no, she won't die here, not like this. Energy rushes in, a shot of adrenaline, and she gets clumsily to her feet. She walks, putting one foot carefully in front of the other, over and over, until finally she reaches the junction. Her eyes dart. She shakes, though she doesn't feel fear. She doesn't feel anything. She puts her rucksack at her feet, then holds out her hand, thumb up. It's early morning, but the road isn't busy. Cars pass infrequently, but eventually one stops. The driver winds down the window. It's a man, of course, but beggars can't be choosers. "Where to, love?" he says, but she doesn't know how to answer him. She hasn't thought that far ahead. She imagines Bluff House. It's as if it's right in front of her, silhouetted against the pale sky, huge and looming with a solitary light shining in an upstairs room. She can never go back. "Love?" She shakes her head. She knows where she wants to end up, but not how to get there, and she has to choose somewhere before he drives off. "Anywhere," she says before opening the door and climbing in. "Anywhere, just away."
Thank you. That does certainly set the mood.
Thanks.
Now, this is, I suppose, to be qualified as a psychological thriller. I suppose.
I hope so. That was what was on my contract. So.
Okay. Well, you succeeded in that. I think it's sort of a subgenre of crime novels, I guess, and you think like detective novels and police procedurals that authorship split fairly evenly between men and women writing them, but psychological thrillers seem to be pretty dominated by female authors. I mean, there's exceptions like, I guess, Linwood Barclay and people like that probably fall into that. And then thinking back to 2011 when I read, this comes as a shock to
you heard it here first.
When I read Before I Go to Sleep, looking back now, I realized I read that with the assumption that it had been written
Yeah.
by a female author. I hadn't really I hadn't thought into it, but and I don't think I was probably that much alone in that. And
You weren't.
all three of your, and that was a female protagonist,
Mm.
and your second novel was, and all three of your novels have been female protagonists. Now, you write under the name of S.J. Watson as opposed to Steve Watson.
Mhm.
Was that calculated? Was that a thing that you wanted to
Yeah.
do for reasons of not having a gender specific?
Yeah, I mean,
Yes, yeah.
very much so. I mean, it was about not being gender specific. It was never about obscuring anything or being duplicitous. I mean, I've never hidden my photos. I've never stopped that from being out in the public. So it was never about pretending to be something I wasn't, but it was more about sort of blurring those lines. I mean, ironically, I think I knew that writing from a female point of view, from a woman's point of view, in the first person was a relatively unusual thing to do for a man. Interestingly, it's not so unusual for a woman to write from a male point of view. But it's still, or less so now actually, I think, but certainly back then, it was more unusual for a man to do it. And so I think I knew that people would be interested and would want to talk about it. And because I was ridiculously naive, I thought if I just call myself S.J. Watson and don't draw attention to the fact that I'm male, people wouldn't talk about it. But here we are 10 years later still talking about it.
It's a subject that I'm afraid doesn't go away.
Yeah, no.
You know,
And I can see why it's interesting. I mean, I remember when I showed the draft of Before I Go to Sleep to my agent, and we were about to send it out for consideration to publishers, my agent said to me, first of all, did I have a middle initial? And would I be happy to send it out under the name S.J. Watson? And I'd already decided I wanted to do that. And part of the reason for me was I knew that the whole book fell apart if you read it and thought, this is clearly a bloke writing this, because that isn't how women think. And actually, there are I probably shouldn't say this, but there are some passages in it now which I'm slightly embarrassed about, but we won't draw attention to those. But I knew the whole book. If you open it by page 4, you'll think, it's clearly a bloke that wrote this, because women don't think that. I knew that the whole book didn't work, so I wanted to send it out and obscure my maleness, if you like, and see what people said. And it was very gratifying when some of the publishers kind of got back to Claire and said, what's she like? How did you meet her? Was she easy to work with? Etc. 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 And so it's actually people still will apologise sometimes. Say, I'm really sorry, I thought you were a woman. But for me, it's a massive compliment.
Well, yes.
In writing, at least.
I should think so. It depends. That's on the weekends and other stuff.
Well,
no, I mean the reason I'm asking that is because psychological thrillers, there's certain tropes in there, and a lot of them is usually that, first of all, that the protagonist is an amateur, isn't a detective, isn't a policeman, it's an average person in some regard, and that there's usually a question of trust betrayed. There's usually your best friend or your husband or a spouse, rather, or whatever, is not who they seem to be ultimately. And very often they're family-based, so they tend to get then called domestic noir or something like that. But it's usually a female protagonist and who's under threat, and it sort of ties into the fact that you're starting, if I can say this, and people will not be otherwise, as a woman in society and culture, you're already starting out in a default position that way. There's already a certain amount of threat there. So I mean, how well psychological thrillers, I'm trying to think of ones that have a male protagonist that would be the person that would be under that kind of threat. I mean, it's a little hard at the moment to think of one, to be honest with you.
I've just read one actually, but it's the threat is also coming from a male. It's about a gay couple. So
okay.
Slightly, but go on.
No, that was the reason why I was saying about authorship and such like that, is that the psychological thrillers seem to operate on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think...
So you could write as a male author about a male character, perhaps it wouldn't quite work as a psychological thriller, unless it's obviously, as you said.
Well, I'm sure there is a way of making it work, but I think it's an interesting. I mean, from the point of view of a writer, I've always been more drawn to, and more interested in sort of women's stories, or women's the particular challenges that women have in society. And I mean, you only have to look at, you know, the Sarah Everard case, for example. But I mean, I don't need to say any more, do I really? But you know, that kind of thing is always. I've always just thought that me as well, and my male friends just don't have the same challenges. We have different challenges, perhaps, but you know, it's the Margaret Atwood quote, isn't it? About, you know, a man is scared that a woman might laugh at her, a woman is scared a man might kill her. You know, and I think so. I was just always drawn to those stories. You know, my female friends worrying about how to get home, you know, from a night out, for example. You know, I don't really need to say very much more than that.
Well, yeah, as I said, it's always been an issue. It's still an issue, and we don't necessarily have to go into the detail that everybody's very much aware of.
I mean, I've often joked that I could have written Before I Go to Sleep from a male point of view, but he would have just sat around watching the same episode of the same football match. I mean, it is a joke. It is a joke. I am joking. But I suppose for me, it's a book about love, first of all, but it's also a book about power, and the power that, in this case, a man wields over a woman who doesn't realise the predicament and the position that she's in.
Well, in yours and in most of these things, women usually they gain agency by the end of it. So there's that they overcome, and obviously there has to be in this sort of fiction there has to be
otherwise it's an
overcoming. Otherwise you're sitting watching television. So. In your and well, there's another thing too. It's about going back to Before I Go to Sleep, and then we'll move on to talking about Carter. Well, this actually leads into it. There's a both in Final Cut and Before I Go to Sleep, there's issues of memory, as in the loss of, or not being able, or blockage of, and it's. I suppose our sense of ourselves is really much tied to our sense of continuity. No matter how much we might misremember the past, or the stories get polished with the telling, there's still there's a continuity to ourselves at present that's based upon what we've done in the past, what's happened to us, and all that sort of thing. And I suppose when that's severed in some way, that does put you in a position of vulnerability. So is that something, again, because you featured it in this novel, in the first novel?
I mean, memory fascinates me. I mean, first of all, I think, you know, you're absolutely right in that our sense of self, our sense of who we are, is so intimately bound up with our memory, with our biographical or autobiographical memories of you know. Hopefully, everyone in this room kind of knows how they came to be here. I don't just mean as in I got in the car and I drove and I looked the petrol and found some or whatever. But you know, as in, you know, I did this and then I went to college and then I you know, everyone's got this idea of what has made them who they are, you know, the good and the bad, and how that has all contributed to the person that they are sat here today. And I was just very fascinated, first of all, by what happens if you don't have that memory. If you don't, and therefore, do you really know who you are? I mean, I'm thinking of the film Before I Go to Sleep. I hope, of course, it's in the book as well. But there's a great bit in the film when Nicole Kidman says something like, "I don't think I'm the kind of person to have had an affair." And sorry, I should say Christine Lucas says that, not Nicole Kidman. But the doctor character says, "How do you know?" And that really, I mean, that for me, that's one of the key lines in the book. It's definitely in the book. I mean, how do we know who we are, really? And the second thing that really fascinated me about memory, and this is something I wrote about. I've just sort of fairly recently launched a what's it called? Mailing list, I suppose. And I wrote about it quite recently, so sign up if you want to read it. But it's fascinating the way that the memory is not reliable. We think we remember things. We almost think that memories are like camcorder or, you know, or video footage, MP3, MP4, whatever footage, but it's not. It's all very, very malleable. And I talk in this essay that I wrote about. There was an experiment that was done several decades ago now, in which they took a group of students and they asked them about incidents from their recent past. And they said, you know, we've been talking to your parents and your friends, so let's talk about this time when such and such happened, and how did you feel about that, and what happened exactly, and can you remember this happening, and can you remember that happening? But one of the things that they did with all of these students was they introduced the time when they went missing in a shopping mall. You know, it was done in America, so shopping centre, I suppose. But they went missing, they disappeared. And for each of them they said, do you remember the time, your parents told us about that time, you were 4 or 5 years old, you disappeared, and they couldn't, and you were gone for 3 or 4 hours. And in most cases, the students, the subjects of this experiment said, I don't really remember that. But, actually, it does ring a bit of a bell, but I haven't got, I can't. But when they then went and revisited those stories several weeks later, and sort of, do you remember this? Do you remember that time? Have you had any more thoughts? The second time, the subjects of the experiment they had added so much detail. They could remember who'd found them, what shop they were stood outside, what they were wearing, like very, very specific details like that. And then at the very end of the experiment, they told them that one of the incidents hadn't never happened, and they were asked to guess or to choose which one felt the most made up or the most unreliable in their head. And very few of them said the shopping mall incident. And I think that just, for me, that's really interesting, because it shows that, you know, you have, when people say, well, that's your truth, not my truth, that can be a very meaningful thing, because I might remember an incident very, very differently from the other person who was involved. But it doesn't, and then the actual objective truth of what really happened, what would be, you know, if someone had filmed it, could be completely different. So there could be 3 versions of this one event. And I just find that very interesting. So I'm not sure if I've answered your question.
Well, you have, in a sense. I mean, as I said, you know, we sort of polish our stories, and they get better with the telling. And in terms of writing too, because I suppose I read so much, I read very critically anyway. But there's a lot of novels that are constructed in first-person past tense.
Yeah.
So the narrator, the protagonist, is relating the story going back into the past. So when you get caught up in the story, you realize they're recounting conversations verbatim. They're describing scenes in detail. And all of this, and I'm thinking, well, if I was telling you about something that happened 20 years ago, I would probably be, you know, reading over things and probably adding bits in and taking other bits out, and I wouldn't be giving you, and then he said, and then she said. So it's a literary device and convention that we accept, but if you think about it, very often books are written in first person past tense, recalling the past.
I always think it's even more marked when you read memoir
or
autobiography, and someone's talking about this conversation that happened 20 years previously, and they're saying, and then he said, and then I said, and I replied, and then this happened. You're like, how do you know that? So of course, you know, it's artistic license, shall we say?
Well, I mean, it's a suspension of another suspension of disbelief, just so we get caught up in the telling of it. But again, it's the thing about memory being malleable, in that we remember things a certain way, and we construct stories around. We construct a narrative. We construct a story that has a beginning, a middle, and an end about our own lives. Yeah. Which isn't necessarily how it works. No. Related to that, and it goes back to the difference between the book and the film. In the book, there's a quite important plot device which is keeping a diary. It's quite key. And in the film, it's a camcorder. Yeah. Which I think changes things a bit, but it works. Obviously, it worked in the film. It was necessary for the film. But then in Final Cut, your protagonist is a documentary filmmaker, so she's recording all this stuff. I'm just wondering if having her do that grew out of the experience, because I know you were somewhat involved with the film, or you were around.
I hung around.
Yeah.
I wasn't really involved in the film. I mean, I had a very good working relationship with Rowan, who wrote the film and directed it, and also Liza, who was the producer. I mean, formally I had no input at all, but they would ring me or email me actually more often and say, oh, we've had this idea, we've good news, we've got Nicole Kidman on board and stuff like that. Are you okay with that? Like I was going to say. But I didn't really have a lot of input. And the thing about remember my own character's name. Sorry, I'm so deeply immersed in the book I'm writing at the moment. I've struggled to remember what characters are called. It's Alex, isn't it?
We'll get to that. Yeah, it's Alex.
It's Alex in front of it.
Or Lex.
Yeah, she's a documentary filmmaker. No, it wasn't really related to the changes that Rowan had made for the film Before I Go to Sleep. It was more about, I became more and more interested, again, in the nature of documentary filmmaking and how can you tell a story without, I don't think you can tell a story without giving your own spin. Even the way that something is edited, can change the narrative, and so therefore, as a filmmaker and as the editor, you're putting your own spin on the material. So I think it was more about that, and there were a few documentaries that particularly fascinated me, which fed into the book and kind of went to create Alex.
Well, her background as a documentary film.
Yeah. I mean, in particular, there was a film that was made. And maybe this is a relevant point actually, because it was actually made by the same people who'd made Before I Go to Sleep. So I was invited to the premiere of it, but it was a film called Life in a Day. And it came out, I think, probably about 6-7 years ago now. And what they'd done is they'd asked people all over the world to film on their camcorders or their phones or iPads or whatever, to film their life on one particular day. They'd chosen a Saturday in July, I think. And they'd deliberately chosen it so it wasn't, nothing particular was happening that day. It wasn't the Olympics or the World Cup or something. And then they received thousands and thousands of hours worth of footage, and then edited it together to create the story of life in this 24-hour period from all around the world. And it was really, again, it was very fascinating to see the differences in the way that people live and the way that people were able to tell their own story. I mean, obviously, I went to a Q&A with the filmmakers, and they were saying they got thousands of hours of utter unusable or even offensive rubbish. They said
how some people spend their day.
They saw things that they just really want to unsee, but never can. But people did manage to tell stories of what it was like to be a human being on planet Earth on the 21st of July 2014 or whatever it was.
I saw it. I remember seeing that. Fascinating.
Yeah, and I just wondered if one of the things that fed into Final Cut was this idea of what about if you did a similar thing, but instead of taking one particular day and the whole world, you took a longer period of time, but a specific community, and asked them to tell their stories. But because I'm drawn to darkness and I write psychological thrillers, it was going to be darkness that kind of emerged from that. So that was one of them.
Well, yes. I think it works really well. And again, it's going back to the memory thing. So it's in this case, as opposed to the journal being the key, it's video, film footage that provides the key, as it were.
Yeah.
It's also, but different than Before I Go to Sleep. I thought Final Cut has a real, and you might have apprehended from your reading initially that has a bit more of a gothic kind of edge to it. I mean, you've got the spooky house on the cliff kind of thing, and the out-of-the-way village, very insular, suspicious of outsider population kind of thing that are all hiding something.
Well, yeah.
So was that, were you thinking was writing this one and said, I could do a bit of Du Maurier?
Yeah, maybe. I mean, it doesn't displease me that you mentioned Gothic in it. I do like modern Gothic, and I mean, Rebecca is my favourite book, so it's interesting that it would be lovely to think if a little tiny bit of that magic had rubbed off on.
I think it's the house on the cliff. I think.
I mean, I've always loved books in which the setting, the location, almost becomes a character in itself and plays. It's not just the backdrop; it's also it's intrinsically intertwined. And so that was one of the things I definitely wanted to do. And the place is fictional. Final Cut is set in a fictional village, but it's very, very much based on a real village called which I think is mentioned in the back of the book, is it? Robin Hood's Bay.
In Yorkshire.
Which I don't know if you've ever been, but it's really it's very spooky. It's very gothic, especially with Whitby. the ruined cathedral not far off, and the Dracula's. It's almost, it's almost a cliche.
Actually, when I got to the end and I read your bit where you were saying about Robin Hood's Bay, I was thinking, aha, because I was visualizing this place, not so much as Robin Hood's Bay, but further on the coast, on the Cleveland coast, places like Stays and
I haven't been there,
Brunswick Bay, which are a bit smaller, a little more isolated kind of thing. Robin Hood's Bay is I've been there several times, but it's very sort of touristy, so it doesn't quite.
I've only been in winter, you see. So
well, there you go. There you go. Less touristy.
Yeah.
But yes, and then I was sort of conflating it with places in Devon and Cornwall and things like that. Because obviously, I was thinking Dunerier as well. But there's sort of this sort of weird amalgamation of that.
Yeah, there's a bit of St Ives in there actually.
Yeah. So when I saw the Robin Hood's Bay, I said, "Aha, yeah, okay." But yeah, so it does. I quite enjoyed the gothicness of it. The villagers who are looking at outsiders and that.
It's a little bit Wickham out maybe.
Oh, I was waiting for yeah. There's now again thinking about all those the Gothic things and going forward with that. It's just sort of more a question about your writing practice now, in as much as so you're writing thrillers. So I was just wondering because again, there's. All your books have twists and turns and reveals at various different points. Do you plan those out, or does it happen in the flow of the story?
This sounds strange, but a bit of both. I sort of, I have an idea of twists and reveals and roughly where they should land. I mean, actually, I say that Final Cut of the 3 books I've published so far was the most planned out. I actually had a spreadsheet with this happens and then I didn't stick to it, but I had, at least I had one. I like to think of it as I had a map, but I did allow myself to wander off and explore on the way. So I did know where the twists would land, but a lot of it also comes, especially with Before I Go to Sleep actually, a lot of it comes in a much more organic kind of way. It was much more, I was very struck by reading or hearing, I can't quite remember who said it or where I read it, but somebody said that the way I envision it anyway is if you imagine an agent or a reader who is reading the book for the first time, and I pictured an agent sort of sitting there in her office with piles of manuscripts, and I've actually now obviously been in an agent's office, and this is actually true, piles and piles of manuscripts, and and there's their assistants at the door with a message from such and such, and then the phone's ringing and there's emails popping through, and also she's probably desperate for a cigarette, and she's got a lunch date she's late for. There's a lot going on.
A bottle of whiskey in your best score.
Well, I wouldn't like to speculate, but it also wouldn't surprise me. There's lots of competing. There's lots of things competing for that person's attention. And it's also true of a reader. We've all got stuff to do. We've all got lives to live, and it's a big commitment to sit down and spend 7 hours with a book, or however long it takes. So when I'm writing, I always think, I don't want this moment to be the moment that the agent or the reader goes, I'm going to put this down actually, because they may not pick it up again. And so every time it felt like the narrative was slightly flagging or was getting a bit boring, I suppose, for want of a better word, I just would try and throw in a surprise or a twist. But I do think twists are an interesting one. I do a book club on Twitter most Thursdays, and a lot of the people, just because of my friendship circle, a lot of the people I talk to are psychological thriller writers. So we end up talking about twists quite a lot. And I think it's almost become a bit of a cliche that a book gets sent out with the most shocking twist ever on the jacket. And I think that can actually do the book a disservice, because I think often the reader will read it looking for the twist. And then sometimes when the twist comes, it's actually disappointing, because I thought it says it's supposed to be shocking. I saw that 20 minutes ago, or 20 pages ago. So it's a tricky one to get right, I think. Because when it works, Sarah Waters' Fingersmith, for example, when it works, the twist is so, I've almost had to throw books across the room because I was just like, no, because it.
I like that character.
Yeah, well, but it's when a twist really works, you have this simultaneous thing going on in your head, which is how could anyone have ever seen that coming? And at the same time, how could I not have seen that coming? It's so obvious. That's what you're looking for.
Yeah.
But that's incredibly difficult to do.
Yeah.
You know, and a lot of time twist books will be published with amazing twists, and you think, okay, space aliens came down, and I mean, you know, you want to be able to see. You want to do this sort of dance with the reader, where you're saying,
So it's
I'm going to dangle all the clues.
But it has to be then believable within,
but it has to
within the
be,
context of the
exactly,
story you've created.
But it's very difficult to do. So my next book is going to no twist.
Getting up to in just a moment. You have a little question. Sorry, just bear with me for a moment while I look at my notes here. Oh, is this? Yeah, I guess it's you probably. Well, it actually goes back to before your first book, because you sort of hit the ground running with that one.
I did a little bit, yeah.
And if you don't mind me saying so, because I did the research on this, that was 2011 when that was published, and you were 40 years old, so no one needs to do the maths.
I'm 50.
So and then that just that was a worldwide bestseller and won awards. And the film got made of it, which you know,
it was the dream. Yeah.
Now, previous to that, and I know I've done a little research on this, so I sort of already know the answer to that. But previous to that, I mean, do you have a drawer and a bureau at home that's full of manuscripts?
I wouldn't say
novels,
no.
Novels that you wrote before, kind of thing.
No, I mean, I would imagine almost any published author would say they have at least one book squirreled away in a hard drive somewhere or in a bottom drawer that it must never see the light of day. And yes, I do have that. And it really, really must never see the light. It will never see the light of day.
It's like Go Set a Watchman, is it? I mean,
well,
will it be published afterwards?
No, it's destroyed. It's not. You know, I think it's part of your apprenticeship. I mean, I've been writing my whole life on and you know, there have been some quite long periods where I wrote very little, but it's always been there. It's always been an ambition. I've always, you know, I haven't always carried a notebook around with me, but I've always had a notebook that was my, you know, so I have got notebooks going back years and years and years, decades, with scraps here and scraps there. I've just forgotten them. Yeah, so I once said this to an American interviewer. I said, yeah, I've got some unpublished manuscripts, you know, some novels that I completed. And then we were chatting on the phone, I think it was, and then I got a phone call a few weeks later from the legal department of the New York Times or wherever it was that she worked for when she was interviewing me, and they wanted to fact check every single thing that said. So it was, and you are definitely 40, yes, sir. Da 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 da. And you went to college here, yes, yes. And then you've written you've got some novels written that have never been published. Yes. How many? I think it really was. How many? And I was like, well, just some. I mean, some are a little more than. They're not novels. They're a chapter, you know, an opening. Some I might have written 20,000 words of. You know. But how many are there? And a few. And he said, what, 50? No, not 50. What, 5? More than 5. We've settled on 20. And then the article when it went out said, he has written 20 novels. Before I Go to Sleep is his 21st novel. And I think that was on my Wikipedia page, and yeah, I mean, luxury problems.
I mean, it certainly begs questions, because I'm trying to conjure the lawsuit that the Times would have to defend itself in about how many unpublished novels you've got squirreled away somewhere. I mean, I think just trying desperately to figure out what possible scenario could.
Exactly.
But then I don't write fiction, so perhaps I'll leave somebody else to construct that story.
Yes.
But I think it was just a leading question into your life before.
Yeah.
Before I Go to Sleep.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I used to work in the NHS, and I worked in children's hearing services. So I worked with deaf and hearing impaired children. And I was the deputy head of a department, quite a large department in South East London. I enjoyed it, but as I, like in many professions, many careers, as I got more and more senior, first of all I spent less and less time with the patients, with the children. It was more and more time attending shitty meetings that got no, sorry. More and more time spending in meetings. We'll edit that out.
We'll bleed that out.
You know, just less and less time doing the job I thought, you know, that I trained to do and wanted to do. But also, as I got more senior, I had less and less time and also energy at the end of the day to actually devote to writing. And so I reached this point where I could sort of see the ambitions I'd always had. From an 8-year-old child, I wanted to be a published novelist. I wanted to be able to walk into a place like this and see one of my books on the shelf. That was always my dream. My dream was never to be the head of a large hearing aid department in South East London. But that was the route I was going down, and I realised that if I carried on having this quite successful career, actually, but my dream would be I'd have to sort of kick it
defer,
until eventually it would be. And I don't want to sound, it's not in a morbid way, but I do remember thinking, when I'm at the end of my life, if I look back and say, I had a go at writing a novel, a proper go, not just dabbling or writing 20 pages, a proper go. I devoted some serious time and some serious energy to it, and I never got a book published, and I failed. It wouldn't really be a failure because I tried. But if I get to the end of my life and look back and go, I never really tried. It was my ambition my entire life, and I couldn't live with that, or I couldn't, that would be a terrible end to my story, if you like. So I thought I had to give it a go.
Yeah.
And my boss was coming up to retirement, so the next logical career step would have been to go for his job. And I didn't want to do it. I just knew I didn't want to do it. So I went into his office and I said, I'd like to go part-time. And he said, you can't go part-time, it's a full-time job. Which actually, now, I realise he should never have said, because, anyway. And when I tell this story, I like to pretend that I turned on my heel and went, I'm leaving! I didn't, I just slunk off. But I did sort of start to make other plans. I thought, I want to go part-time, and I want to have space in my life to do some proper writing. And so I did go, I got a different job, much more junior, blah, 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 but it was part-time. And right before I go to sleep, and the rest is history.
Well, that's no, but it certainly is history. And
I'm joking, but I think the fact I'd made a sacrifice, my take-home pay probably halved overnight. Now I'm not trying to pretend I was eating cold baked beans out of a tin. I had at the time I had a very supportive partner. We had income. I was never looking at not being able to eat
Grub Street.
Yeah. I was looking at not being able to go on quite as many nice holidays. But it felt like a sacrifice. I would talk to people, my family understood actually, but more often my friends. I would talk to my friends and go, yeah, I've gone part-time and I've also gone from this band to this band. And they'd go, why? Why have you done that? And it felt, and to say, because I want to write a novel, felt a bit sort of, he's having a midlife crisis, which arguably I was.
Yeah, one could chalk it up to that, but so instead of buying a sports car...
Yeah, I wrote a book.
You wrote a book, which I think is probably all...
Yeah, but the fact I'd made a sacrifice, I think, actually meant that I remember the very first day, I was kind of on my non-work day, so when I was on my part-time day off, I thought I've got to work on a book today, because there was no way I was going to make that sacrifice and then watch daytime TV, or waste my time.
This is before the days of Twitter.
Yes, probably.
Yeah. I think there's I'm on Twitter for a brief period of time. I don't go on it anymore. There's a number of writers on there that I follow, and I'm thinking, what are they writing?
Well, you can schedule tweets, so there's a lot of that going on for me.
Okay, it looks like it's reassuring.
I may well be tweeting as we speak. I don't know. I looked at my screen time the other day though, and I noticed it was most days, my average screen time is 6 hours plus on my phone, not even on the computer. And I'm like...
On a day?
Yeah. Like, imagine the books I could write if I didn't do that.
That's a lot of time.
It is a lot of time,
That's almost a full-time job.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
But I also, this is actually one of the things I noticed about Final Cut is, a lot of thrillers and crime novels I've read of late, people have been setting back 1980, 1970, something like that, which is the trick is to have it pre-internet, pre-mobile phone.
Well, pre-mobile phone is the thing, yeah.
Internet's been around for a while, but I guess most things are mobile phones, which changes the game. It makes it a lot more difficult for...
Well, how can you engineer two people not to be in touch with each other?
Yeah.
You can't have people going missing, it's very difficult. Well, you have to find an elaborate way of... I nearly scrapped my entire second book when someone told me that you could get mobile phone signal on the Eurostar, because the whole plot point hinged on while one character was underneath the channel that they were out of contact. And so someone said to me, you know, you can get signal. And I was like, no, how long has it been? I set it 2 years ago then.
You have to come up with something else, like a pulse of solar energy or something like that. It's knocked it all out or something like that. But in Final Cut, it is worked into the story, and I think you're successful.
Well, I wanted to write a book that was actually, in a way, it kind of deals with social media and the way that we are interacting with it. I think Second Life, my second book, is kind of, for me, it's a book. One of the things it's about is the way that social media allows you to create an invented version of yourself and to pretend, if you like, I'm oversimplifying obviously, but pretend to be somebody else, to put forward a different version of yourself into the world that isn't the real you that your friends and family and close loved ones see. Whereas with Final Cut, I almost wanted to flip that and talk about the way that the internet and specifically social media can be quite exposing. So it can, you may be trying to hide some truth about who you are, but the way that everybody shares stuff on Instagram and Twitter to a slightly lesser extent and things like that kind of can be quite exposing. So they're almost flip sides of the same coin.
It's not even the things that you filmed yourself or your friends have filmed, but I mean, we're being filmed.
Well, there's this lady here whose husband doesn't know she's in this event.
All
I mean,
the time,
that could get out if that's,
Well, it's my wife. So if she's up to something, I think she's chosen the wrong route for that. But no, I mean, we're recorded and filmed all the time. Very often not aware of it, and sometimes that stuff gets out and about, and it doesn't necessarily put us in the best light. But again, I think it's just the fact that there's, as I was saying, there's a lot of times people have to go, for their story to work, in terms of a detective story, a thriller, or something like that, a mystery. They need to sort of get rid of mobile phones and things like that somehow. So I appreciate the fact that I thought either
get rid of them or just embrace them fully. Yeah. But it's a difficult challenge as well, though, because I want to write books that are accessible to people who aren't glued to their mobile phone for 6 hours a day, and don't necessarily even. I think you can read both Final Cut and Second Life if you have only the barest knowledge of what Instagram is or Twitter is. I don't think you don't need to be sort of immersed in that. I'm trying to sell the book to everyone now, but you don't need to be immersed into that world to get it. I don't think, because it's more about it's not about the tools that allow this kind of sharing or allow this bleeding into different lives. It's more about the effects of it.
It's a little hard to talk about this without giving away too much about the book, but it's not. It doesn't all take place there. It's an important thing in the book, but the book progresses within a real world, within a real action and things that happen to the protagonist. I think it grips you pretty quickly, and you're there. So I think you've done with that. I think I've got other questions here, but I think it's time we could open up to the audience if anybody feels they would like to ask Steve a question. Okay, there we are.
So I'm a fantasy teacher. I'm a big believer in inspiring children to love reading. You mentioned about 8 years old. You decided you wanted to do it. So what was it that inspired you at that phase?
Sorry, just before you answer that, did everybody over here hear the question? Sorry about that, Steve.
I don't. On the one hand, I don't know. I've just always loved books. I'm an only child, which I think has probably something to do with it. I found it difficult to make friends, shall we say. So books throughout my childhood were a sort of a refuge. I am the cliche of the person that was hiding underneath the duvet or the blankets back in those days with a torch. I'd always got a book on the go. I remember my mum used to read to me from for as long as I can remember, probably before I even understood a word of what we were talking about. But books are always. It's funny because I didn't come from a sort of bookish family. We didn't have shelves and shelves and shelves of books in the house, but books have always been part of my world and part of my life. I used to go to the library in Dublin weekly, I think, and get. I used to love that, choosing. I think I could take 5 books out, and I got a mix of fiction and non-fiction. They've just always been there. They've always been things that I've returned to, and I always think if you don't read, it's like you must. I think the thing about reading is you get to live more than one life. So, does that answer your question?
Yeah.
In terms of specifics, I remember. I read there was, the early days of Enid White, slightly dodgy thing to talk about now. But yeah, I used to love the Magic Faraway Tree books in particular, and then my mum tells a story about how my cousin and I, we used to demand that she read Jack the Giant Killer to us, and even though it's terrified both of us, but every night, we would always just read Jack the Giant. So it's always just been there in various.
Can I ask that? So did you ever find that sometimes when you were taught it through the education system, did that turn you off at all with it? Because I noticed in your opening bit, I straight away I was like, oh, there's some good similes I could share with my class. And then I thought, oh, hang on, no, sometimes I'm picking text too much to do that. And did you find that sort of the education still aligned with your passion for books? It didn't turn you off?
There was, so did everyone hear that part of the question? There was a specific teacher who I think recognised in me a love of books. She loved Tolkien, and I got completely just drawn in by the whole, specifically actually the Lord of the Rings, just not so much the Hobbit. We read the Hobbit in class, but she could see that some of us wanted to take it further. So I just remember loving, and this would have been when I was maybe 9 or 10, and she obviously recognised that I was just really into this, and so she lent me, she had all the C.S. Lewis books, the Narnia books, and she lent me all of those, and other books as well, mostly fantasy kind of books. She lent me the Silmarillion. I demanded the Silmarillion. I read every single word of that book, and I swear, I was on a holiday in Cornwall, sitting in a caravan as it rained, and I read every word of the Silmarillion, and I swear I didn't understand a word of it.
You lost it then.
Yeah.
You're not alone in that.
No, you're not alone.
But yeah, so I think there are specific teachers, and also a different teacher who I think when I was younger actually, but encouraged writing. I think we used to write stories in class, and she could see that I'd got some talent or some love of it anyway. And she was like, you should write more, and you should send these off to magazines. We were saying you should send these off to magazines, but to me that was like, oh no, that doesn't really, no, that's not. So there's specific teachers, but the education system, I don't know that really helped my love of reading, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I got a B in English literature for that. Because the books, I didn't like the books that we were learning. We did. Well, I won't go into specifics. It's not important. They weren't books that gripped me, so I didn't do particularly well.
Any other questions then?
Is there any other genre? Oh, sorry.
No, that's good. You first. Okay, you had your hand up first.
Is there any other genre that you'd like to try your hand at other than psychological thriller?
Is there any other genre I'd like to try? Yes. What it is, I don't know. I love psychological thrillers, obviously. I think what I love about them, though, is the twisty-turniness, if that makes sense. It is the way you can surprise a reader and use that, playing with truth and lies and duplicity and betrayal and all those kind of, But I am also interested, I think, in writing something different. My ideal career would be one in which I could write whatever I wanted. Not many people manage that. It's interesting, what I was saying earlier in response to the other question. The books that I kind of cut my teeth on, if you like, as a reader, were fantasy. I don't read fantasy now. Not through any reason, not because I don't like it or anything, I just don't read it. science fiction as well. I used to love science fiction. I don't read science fiction anymore. I love, in terms of books I would want to write one day, I love dystopias. Is that the plural, dystopia? I love dystopias, anyway. I would love to write a dystopian novel. But it's, at the moment, it'd be really difficult, because it takes you 2 years at least to write a book and then for it to come out, I would say. And by that time, the dystopia that you've created has become reality. So I don't know how I would deal with that. But, you know, I would never say never. I have yet to put it to my publisher that I want to write my sci-fi trilogy. But maybe.
Yeah, I was just going to ask you what you like to read now for pleasure or relaxation. I am pleased you said you don't read science fiction or fantasy, because I hate those genres.
Yeah.
But what do you like for
What do I like to read?
relaxation or pleasure?
I read really widely, although I do, and this is definitely, I don't want to sound like I'm complaining about this, it's definitely a perk of my job, is I get sent a lot of books. You know, for the little blurbs, the quotes that are often on the front, you know, often from Stephen King, no comment. He manages to read as much as he reads. But, you know, I get sent a lot of new books, and so it's a great privilege to often, or to be one of the first people to have read a book. They do tend to be psychological thrillers, so I do read a lot of psychological thrillers still. I don't read all the ones I get sent, but I do still read a lot of those. But I also like to read outside the genre, if you like. So I don't limit my reading to. Basically, if a book looks interesting, I will have a go at it often. I don't always finish every book I start. I finish more books than I should, to be honest, because I have this kind of attitude that, okay, I've only got 100 pages to go now, and the person who wrote this has obviously put a lot of effort, so I'll just wade through. I mean, it's a bit of a ridiculous thing to be honest. I should just put it down and read something better. But yeah, I mean, I read really widely. A lot of what you might call literary fiction, but to me, I think that's just another genre.
Do you ever read the classic?
No.
Okay.
No, I mean, some of them, I mean, what are the classics? I mean, some of them, I remember when I first started doing events like this, and I felt very much, well, and actually being in the world, I suppose, well, not so much events like this, but when I started being in the world of published authors and mingling with other authors that were published, I used to have this dreadful imposter syndrome, and feel that one day somebody was going to say to me, well, of course you've read Jane Austen, haven't you? And I thought, well, so I'd better read, I can't remember what the bloody called now. Anyway, I'd better read
the canon.
Yeah, I'd better read the canon, exactly, because then I can hold my head up high amongst these events, and with my glass of warm red wine, I can be. But I read a few of them, and I thought, actually, I'm not enjoying them. They're not. I'm not saying they're bad. They're not. Obviously, they're not bad books. They're a reason that they've been around for hundreds of years, and they've been so widely read, and they're still taught in schools, and so on and so on and so on. But I just realised it's not. They're not. A lot of them aren't for me. So there's a lot of the books that I should have read that I haven't read. You know, the thing that goes round every 6 months about here are the BBC's 100 books that everyone should read. Often I don't score particularly highly on those.
That's nice to hear, actually, because
Yeah.
I there are lots of classics I've not read.
You're reassured by that?
Yes, I am.
But the flip side of that is, but you can talk about books. Often I'll walk in, you know, people will say to me, have you read X, Y, and Z that's been out in the last 2 years? Okay, yeah. So I think I'm widely read, but just not books from hundreds of years ago.
I love psychological thrillers, and I'm particularly interested in psychology, but you said your favourite novel was Rebecca. I've only read your first novel, so it's something just your third now. But I'm aware that, you know, there's the similarity between Rebecca and Before I Go to Sleep is this gap between reality and perception. And I wondered if there was anything you could hang anything on as a child growing up, where you, because this was your first successful book, your first fully fledged manuscript, whether there was something that you're aware that you had some particular interest in this gap, any inspiration?
The gap between perception and reality.
Yeah, this.
Well, it's interesting because, well, first of all, I have to make an admission, which is that when I wrote For a Go to Sleep, I hadn't read Rebecca. I read Rebecca really quite late. So it had no impact on the writing of For a Go to Sleep. But I remember showing, actually, before she'd even read it, so I gave my person who's now my agent a draft of Before I Go to Sleep, and she said to me, "Where are you in this book?" And I very grandly said, "I'm not in this book at all," because to me it was about a 40. I was at the time I was 40. It's about a 47-year-old woman who has lived this life and has no memory. And I'm not in this book in the slightest. 2 years later, I could look back on Before I Go to Sleep, and I'm on every single page of that book, because in the context that to me, Before I Go to Sleep is a book about a woman who goes to sleep at the age of, say, 17, with all these dreams and aspirations about what she wanted to do, what she was going to do with her life, the person she was going to marry, the place she was going to live, the life she was going to have, I suppose. And then wakes up 30 years later and goes, "This isn't what I wanted, this isn't where I wanted to be, this isn't the person I wanted to marry, this isn't the house I wanted to live in, this isn't the job I wanted to do. What happened to my ambitions? Where did they go?" And I think that was I don't want to kind of over dramatise it, but that was kind of the situation in a way that I was in. I'd sort of reached I think it's no coincidence that I was approaching my 40th birthday as I was writing it, because it's not old, obviously, but it's a significant.
Be happy to sign books if people wanted
Yeah.
to purchase. Those that haven't already bought and read it. I hope you've been intrigued enough to want to see what it's about. And I want to thank you very much for a very enjoyable
Thank you.
evening. We'll just say.
So I just stay here to sign?
That doesn't have to say.
Yeah.